All right, welcome back, guys. We're going to continue with skeletal system as far as our material and where we left off. All right, so let's see where we were. We were talking about ossification, the process of bone growth in which the cartilage is going to harden and turn into new bone. Again, the whole idea here is that you do not need an absurd amount of of cartilage. Um, a little bit of cartilage is all you really need. Don't need anything absurd. Bone tissue is obviously going to be more rigid and necessary to support the body. The cartilage itself is helpful, it's essential, especially for preventing friction. But as you notice, as we grow older, we have much less of it in our body. Okay, types of bone cells. So let's talk about this stuff. First of all, I would make sure you understand that the suffix cyte, C-Y-T-E, let me re-underline that, C-Y-T-E, I would make sure we know that the suffix cyte is in reference to cells. So anytime that it ends in cyte, that's a type of cell. You're going to see that suffix in a lot of different terms in the future. Osteo means bone. So what is an osteocyte? It's what we see here. It's a bone cell, a mature bone cell. There are other types of cells as well that are made in the bone that we need to know as well. They're more specialty cells, if you want to call them that. Osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Osteoblasts, their job, based off of a mnemonic, their job is blast, build, bone. So they make new bone. That's their job. Whereas class, they have a mnemonic as well. Not as creative, I guess, if you want to call it that, or not as roll off the tongue. But the class, I say that the class consume bone. So they eat away at bone or they destroy bone cells. Now, let's think about that for a second. This process of destroying bone cells, it does release calcium and your body reabsorbs said calcium. But why would you do that in the first place? Well, the idea is that when bones get old, because bone is a living tissue, right? When bone cells get old, your body doesn't want you to have frail bones. So it's going to use the osteoclast to destroy the old cells. Then the osteoblasts are going to come in and start making new cells until eventually they maturize and become osteocytes. It is a very frail and fine balance between these blasts and clasts. If you have too many blasts, what ends up happening is that you can create unnecessary growth, which is referred to as cancer. If you have too many clasts, it actually weakens the bones and makes them frail, and that can lead to conditions like osteoporosis, which we'll learn about later in this particular unit. So again, just knowing that there's this balance between the two, very, very important. Let's go ahead and erase this stuff. Okay, let's put us back to where we were. All right. Next, I got a video. I'm going to embed it into, or just put it in the about section for my YouTube video. But it's all about bone transplants. It's a TED-Ed video. It's really, really well done. It talks about how we deal with injuries when we have serious bone injuries. Basically, many times we're going to have to require a transplant. And there's some pretty cool technology talked about in there. There's some pretty legitimate science as far as the possibilities of using stem cells to grow new bone cells, which could hopefully be in our future. Okay, speaking of when you have traumatic injuries, let's talk about fractures. A fracture is simply a break in the bone, right? There are two main types of fractures that we should observe. We have closed fractures and open fractures. A closed fracture is also known as a simple fracture. Why is it referred to as a simple fracture? Because it's a break in the bone that does not penetrate the skin. That doesn't necessarily mean it's always a better thing. For instance, if you have a break in the ribs, even though you may not see the ribs protruding out of the skin, sometimes the ribs can protrude inward, and that may puncture the lungs, and that could be fatal. An open fracture or a compound fracture, rule of thumb, generally speaking, is going to be worse because it's an instance where the bone has penetrated the skin. So now the bone you can physically see it. That's normally obviously not a good thing. How do we treat fractures? Well, we treat them via reduction and immobilization. What is the best method of reduction and immobilization? Casts, splints, right? These are all things that are designed to limit and restrict movement and motion. So that's a big part of it. Obviously, it depends on how bad your injury is, how long you may have to wear said cast. But this is something that is essential to making sure that you don't re-injure yourself. Now, in some cases, the fracture could be so serious that you have to realign the bone. So that does happen from time to time. Okay, regarding the common types of fractures, I'm not expecting you to learn all of this. More than anything, can you identify the name of the fracture and what it looks like? That's the big thing for me. So let's start with the top. Comminuted fracture. A comminuted fracture is what you see here. A comminuted fracture is going to be a bone break that creates many fragments. So you see a lot of these little pieces. This is very common in individuals who are elderly and whose bones have become more brittle. Every single one of us age, right? We get older. As we get older, our bodies are going to become a little bit more decrepit and weaker. That said, you still see 70-year-old people that are weightlifting and running marathons. The only reason they're able to do that is because at a younger age, they were very active. If you were very sedentary most of your life, and then suddenly at 70, you're like, for this year, I want to run the Boston Marathon. It's not very realistic, right? You can definitely get active. You can continue to stay active, even at an older age, even if you weren't doing it when you were younger. But you have to adjust, go for walks, do your yoga, do your Pilates, do very light weightlifting, stuff like that. Compression and depression. Here we see the compression, which is on the top. Depression would be more so near the ear region. In the compression, the bone is crushed. I always think of the classic Looney Tunes situation of dropping an anvil on someone. It is literally crushing the bones. This is most common in porous bones. And again, if we remember our terms from our last video, or 2 videos ago, the porous means spongy or holes. So spongy bone is going to be very porous. And what type of bone has a lot of porous regions? Short bones. Again, weightlifting can be pretty problematic with this if you're not doing proper form or if you don't have someone to spot you. A depression or a depressed injury is when the bone is pressed inward. Typical of skull fractures, what I tend to think of for this is like an instance where somebody has like a baseball bat and smacks somebody across the face, like in a gory type film. When that happens, it's going to cause the skull to indent. Obviously, that can be a very traumatic injury because it could damage the brain. Impacted, that's what we see up here. An impacted injury is when the bone ends are forced into each other. This commonly occurs when one attempts to break a fall with outstretched arms. If you're in my classroom and I'm on the second floor and you're jumping out the window and you try to catch yourself with your palms of your hand, the humerus would lodge itself straight into the shoulder blade, just like what we see here in this picture. Those two bones would fuse. And when you go to the hospital, they would literally require a bone saw to separate the two bones together. So very traumatic injury. Spiral, that's what we see in the arm. A spiral injury is going to be a break which occurs when excessive twisting forces are applied to the bone. This is one of the most common sports fractures that can occur. Typically, any sport that requires a pivot, so basketball, football, soccer, lacrosse, any of these sports that you pivot in, the problem with that, a pivot can be a great move to build distance between you and an opponent. But if you're pivoting and you're not positioned, your pivot foot is not solid, like it's not legitimately in place, your body can now move in 2 different directions simultaneously, and that can split the bone. In football and a lot of other contact sports, even sometimes lacrosse in rare occasions, but more so in football because of tackling, you can have instances where somebody is trying to juke a player who's coming at them, and they may juke them, but then suddenly a blind side, somebody comes at from an angle that you didn't see, and they hit you. That can cause that twisting action. When that twisting action occurs, it's like a hot knife through butter. It just splits the bone right in half. Finally, green stick. Green stick is named this way because it's like a twig that you snap and you still see the parts of it still attached to it. It's an incomplete break. This is most common amongst children. So if you've ever had a fracture when you were younger, it might have been a green stick fracture. And the biggest reason for that, apart from the fact that, as children, we make a lot of stupid mistakes because we don't really understand accountability or repercussions. But when we're younger, our bones are more flexible. So you don't want to necessarily have bones that are super flexible. Flexibility can be a good thing, but not bones. With regards to bones, your bones should be more rigid. Okay. And finally, when it comes down to how our body heals. So our body has a great healing process. We're not like Wolverine. We can't just heal instantly, but we do heal over time. In the instance of a bone fracture, the very first thing that's going to happen is called a hematoma. Toma, or oma as a suffix, is referring to a swelling. Hema means blood, and we're going to learn more about that in cardiovascular system. So literally blood-filled swelling. It's what you see here. Even if you've never had a bone fracture, you've likely had hematoma before, or some sort of hematoma, because it's basically bruising. It's where you have a blood vessel under the skin that is ruptured. Within the first week of the injury, your body's going to transfer into the second stage called the fibrocartilage callus. So your body creates a splint to immobilize that region that has been damaged, and it forms this fibrocartilage callus. It's not like the calluses that form on your hands. It's just designed to be like a Band-Aid. You're literally holding everything in place. This is very sensitive to future damage. Now, the callus, over months, weeks, depending on how bad the injury is, will then start to be replaced by what's called a bony callus. So this is more bone than anything else. Finally, the bony callus is going to be remodeled and forms a permanent patch, so it fuses together with the rest of the bone. But just like I mentioned back in an integumentary system, what we have to be concerned with is that when you have a traumatic injury, you do run the risk of re-injuring yourself due to scar tissue. So the same thing can happen in the skeleton. The bone can be fractured, it can heal, but sometimes you get a scar on the bone, and then it can become more easy to re-damage that area. Okay, so that's actually where we're going to stop. It's a great place for us to end. Again, this is a lengthier unit. It's about 70-something slides, so we'll be taking our time through this stuff, okay? All right, so thanks for tuning in, guys. I'll see you guys on the next one. Have a great day.